Ding dong YouTube, welcome back to the channel. I'm the Jobless Coder, and this weekend I had the opportunity to use the Unreal game engine, and I was immediately reminded of why I had never used this game engine before. It has nothing to do with whether or not Unity or Unreal are better or worse than each other. It has nothing to do with the fact that Unreal is a more complicated game engine to learn, or whether or not there's more or less tutorials on YouTube for one engine or the other, or because there's more asset packages in the Unity Asset Store that are available for download, or even because it uses C++ as a coding language, which is old and outdated and more complicated to read than C#, which is the language that Unity uses, or any of that shit. The number one reason that I had never previously used Unreal is that anytime I have ever tried to install it, I could never get it to install. More on that later, but for now, I just want to say to anyone that's new to the channel, make sure to subscribe. If you're returning but are not a subscriber, make sure to subscribe for more videos. On this channel, I talk about tech, I talk about mental health, I talk about politics. It's basically a variety show for whatever things I need to feel like talking about at the time. So if that sounds interesting to you, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel. So, where to start? Well, this weekend, if you are aware, if you're not aware, this weekend was the Global Game Jam. And if you're not familiar with what that is, basically it is a 48-hour event that transitions from Friday evening to Sunday evening, where you get together with groups of people to make a game. And prior to COVID, it was mostly done in person at colleges and universities or various other institutions of learning that would host these events. But during COVID, it was exclusively remote, so now post-COVID, it's a steady mix of in-person and remote as a hybrid site. So for me, living with my parents, I'm fully able to participate in the Game Jam at basically any Game Jam site that I want to. So I normally do the one with Lethbridge, as it's the university I went to, and I had previously done the Game Jam. My first year of the Game Jam was in 2018, and that was also my first time ever using the Unreal editor. So I typically tend to learn at least one new thing every time I do the Game Jam. When I did my first Game Jam in 2018, it was the first Game Jam I had ever done, and I had never used Unity before. And so I ran into this big problem where I was working on the UI, and the other person was working on the multiplayer for the game. It was a simple multiplayer game. And then when we had to merge his multiplayer scene with mine, because I had not been doing the UI in a prefab, he had to basically take everything, dump it into prefab, pull it into his level, and when he did, basically everything in their positions that I had perfectly aligned the way that I wanted in the scene that I was working in, they all got broken because I didn't know what prefabs were, and I didn't know how to work with prefabs either. So I learned the hard lesson in that Game Jam to always use prefabs for your own stuff so that other people can pull it in with what they're working on and integrate it into the project. Now, looking back on that project, after having worked with Unity for 4 years, I will say that the other developer probably could have integrated it a little better to retain the structure of the UI that I had constructed, but we're also crunched for time as you are in a Game Jam. So things like the positioning of items in the UI, if they get screwed up, that's not a big deal as opposed to whether or not the multiplayer can work. So the next time I did the Game Jam was actually when I was out in Vancouver, and it was also another multiplayer game. And for that Game Jam, we had a requirement to randomly generate rooms in a house, and I wanted to learn how to do that procedurally so that it was different every time. So what I ended up learning was what is referred to in the gaming industry as technical artistry, procedurally generating rooms that are unique and different for a unique gameplay experience each time the game is played. So I learned about that. And my primary goal this year for doing the Global Game Jam was to learn Unreal as an engine. I didn't care what the theme was. I didn't care what the game was that we were making. I just wanted to learn something different because I have now 4 years of professional experience with Unity, and I know the engine very well inside and out. There's a lot of things that I still don't know or that I've never used before. I'm not well versed in multiplayer. I haven't used the lighting system in depth to all of its capabilities. I'm very novice with the terrain system. There's a lot of things in Unity that I don't know, but I do know the fundamentals of how to make a game in Unity, and that was exactly what I didn't want to do. I didn't just want to make yet another Unity game. So I went into this Game Jam primarily hoping to learn Unreal. Well, the problem is that the jam site that I was participating in Lethbridge, they had 11 people in person plus me telecommuting remotely for this game jam. And there was 3 teams. Every one of the teams was using Unity. So I decided to look around to see other local game jams. Calgary was not even having a game jam this year, so I checked in with Edmonton. I even sent a message to the game jam group in Discord in Vancouver that I had previously participated in, hoping that someone there would be using Unreal. Now, my primary initiative for learning Unreal this game jam is because I've been doing a lot of interviews recently with AAA studios that I've been failing because I don't remember a lot of the basics of C++, and I've never used Unreal before. So if I ever got an interview that asked questions specifically about the Unreal Engine, then I would be absolutely screwed. So I should have that knowledge if I'm going to be applying for these jobs and potentially getting interviews. So I sent a message to the Edmonton Game Jam site and the one in Vancouver, and it took me about 3.5 hours to finally find a group. The game jam started at 6 p.m. and it wasn't until about 9:30 or even 10 o'clock at night when someone finally reached out to me asking if I was still looking for a group. There was one team in all of Edmonton that was using Unreal, and so I decided to join them to see what I could learn. It's worth noting that I did not at the time have Unreal Engine currently installed on my computer, although if I did, it was going to be the wrong version anyways, because I was trying to install Unreal version 5, and they were using version 4.27.2, which are entirely incompatible with each other, so I've been told. Prior to starting this group, I had started the installation process of Unity 5 on my computer around 6 o'clock. And it ran for several hours until I had found this group, at which point I canceled the installation process and started installing 4.27.2. Now, I will say that I live in town and we have fiber optic internet. My internet is not the problem at all, and I even did an internet speed. I'll put that up here on the screen right now so you can see what my internet speeds are. So I will admit that I take some responsibility on my end for not having the required equipment ready to go at the start of the game jam. Obviously, 48 hours to make a game is not a lot of time, and even spending 2 hours to install a game engine is a lot of time wasted that you shouldn't be doing. However, in my defense, I did not expect that something that is supposed to be a professional tool, that is supposed to be industry standard and used by major AAA studios all over the world, would take any longer than an hour, maybe 2 hours at most, to install. It should, under no circumstance, require 26.5 hours to install, which from start to finish was the entire process that it took me to install the Unreal Engine. And, well, you can see for yourself.
Well, it is now midnight, and I am still installing the Unreal Engine. By my calculations, it's not going to be ready until about noon on Saturday. My Epic Game Installer just keeps fluctuating between 0 bytes per second and, ooh, look at that, a whole whopping 56 kilobytes per second. It is now 1 in the morning, and we are downloading consistently at around 0 bytes per second. It's now 2 a.m. in the morning. It is now 3 a.m. in the morning. I'm tired. I'm pissed off. I haven't contributed a single thing to my Game Jams team. I'm going to bed, and when I wake up, it had better be ready to use. So, as you can see, it's now 10 in the morning, and Epic Games has still failed to install.
At this point, the installation of Unreal Engine 5 had already been going for several hours, so I got in contact with one of my colleagues who lives in Quebec, and I asked him if he would download it where he lives and then upload it to one of our private servers. So he did that, and it took about an hour to download and install on his computer. He put it in a zip file and then began the upload process through FileZilla. And, well, he left that running all night. It only completed 25% come the morning, and because it wasn't until about 9:30 that I found the group using Unreal 4.27.2, it would have been the wrong version anyways. It had been 6 hours since I started the installation process of the Unreal Engine, and given the time invested, I could have installed 30 or 40 different versions of Unity in that same amount of time. It takes me about 20 minutes to download and install each version of Unity, and each version of Unity tends to be about 5 or 6 gigabytes. So again, it's not my internet speed that is the issue. I can download a file from Google Drive that's about 20 gigabytes in roughly an hour and a half. There's no justification or reason that it should take a full 6 hours or more to install. At this point, I realized that the Epic Games servers are made from actual potatoes, and that it may never install on my computer. I have a friend who lives in Brazil who offered to download it on his computer and offered me to connect remotely via TeamViewer, which I did, and I was able to get at least a little work done on the game jam using TeamViewer to connect to his computer remotely from Canada to Brazil. It is now 11:30. It has been a full 17 and a half hours of trying to install Unreal, and as you can see, I have the project for the Game Jam finally open. And so this is how I'm going to have to do the Game Jam, is remotely via his computer. I deleted Epic Games Launcher and reinstalled it, and I'm also deleting the entire folder of Unreal Engine and reinstalling it under a subdirectory here. It turns out that there's a setting when you go to install this program that automatically enables modules for Linux build and Android build, even though I'm doing a Game Jam project for Windows. So unlike Unity, where there's different modules that you can install and you actually pick them on the install process, and then you can go in and install the separate modules, it just automatically enabled them for some fucking reason on a Windows machine, because I guess it assumes I need to be able to build for Linux. And as you can see, the install process is now significantly less in file size. Instead of 13 gigabytes, it's only 8. But once again, we're fluctuating between 0 bytes and, whoa, a whole 100 kilobytes. Although this offered its own set of circumstances where I continued to have the screen glitch out on me every so often, and I would have to close down TeamViewer and then restart the connection, and also there was a little bit of noticeable lag that was making it exceedingly frustrating to work with when I moved my mouse, and a half second later the mouse on the remote machine also moved. Apparently, Brazilians have better internet than we do in Canada, given that Canadians spend the highest on average bill for internet and cell phone than any other country in the world. I had spent the evening watching some tutorials on how to use the Unity blueprint system, but it was still confusing me to quite a degree. I didn't even know how to make a UI, so I had asked one of the team members in the morning that I was working with to show me how to do it. And so he showed me around the process of creating the UI widget and going through the designer to connect up variables on the graph view in order to actually code logic into the UI. So I did that for most of the afternoon. I decided I would start with the UI, as the first time I ever did the Game Jam, the first time I had done a game in Unity, I had done the UI, and it seems to be the easiest thing for me to do, and it's the one that I enjoyed doing the most. I also wasn't comfortable making changes to game systems, given that I had never used blueprints before and that I would most likely break something that the other members of the team were working on. Luckily, there was about 6 other people on the team, and so we had artists and a guy working on audio and a couple different programmers. Now, the programmers were fairly novice themselves. They had never really used Unreal before. There was one guy that had used it for, he said, about 4 years, but he hadn't used it recently, and so he was struggling to remember exactly how everything worked. And certain questions I had just didn't get answered because no one on the team could figure out exactly what the issue was that I was having, but we found a workaround. For example, I had done a list of UI widgets in one of the UI widget windows, and I had dragged in references to those, but then when I clicked compile, all of the references got set to null, and I could not figure out why that was happening. It didn't matter what I did. Every time I clicked compile and save, the references were being set to null. So the workaround that I found for this is that on the construct method, I just manually added those references to the list, and it fixed the problem from breaking. I got a message that afternoon from another colleague of mine living in Seattle, Washington. He was asking how our various projects were going, so I explained to him the situation I was facing, being unable to install the Unreal Engine. So he downloaded it and installed it on his machine through the Epic Game Launcher, and it took him 4.5 minutes to do so. He put it in a zip file, uploaded it to Google Drive, and then I downloaded it from there, which took me roughly 6 minutes to download and install. When I had woken up in the morning to find that the editor installation had crashed during the night, I went to install it again, and I realized that there's some settings that are turned on by default, including Linux build support and Android. Given that we were making a game for Windows desktop, that was entirely irrelevant. So I turned those two options off, which should have never been turned on by default to begin with, as they're not turned on by default when installing Unity. You have to install them separately, and that reduced the file size from 13 to 8. So my friend in Seattle, Washington downloaded an 8 gigabyte file. He installed it on his computer, zipped it up, and the entire compressed version of the zip file was 6, which took my computer about 6.5 minutes to download and install. 6.5 minutes to solve a 25.5 hour long problem. Now, there is several different ways that you can install the Unity editor. You can install it through the Unity Hub, which is the equivalent for Unity of the Epic Game Launcher. You can also just download the installation package directly from the website and install it there. And you can also get it from the Unity GitHub. Now, with Unreal, the only way that you can download and install a working version of the editor is through the Epic Game Launcher. Epic apparently hosts their source code on GitHub, which you can get access to basically for free. You just have to request account access into the GitHub repository, but it is the engine source code, meaning that you have to download the source code and then compile the engine itself on your machine before it can run. And given the fact that anything that I have ever tried to download anytime, anywhere, never works directly out of the box, I figured that probably wasn't a good solution either, as it would probably not immediately compile the first time I tried to run the engine. And given that I have no idea how the engine was built or constructed, or any of the stuff that goes into making it run, I would not be able to troubleshoot why it would not compile on my machine if I had done it that way. Plus, I would have to wait for someone on the GitHub to approve my access, which might not have happened anytime during the weekend during a 48-hour game jam. Finally, after downloading the 6 gigabyte zip version of the package, I had to spend another hour and a half trying to clean up files on my system so that I could install it somewhere, because it took 30 gigabytes to unzip a 6 gigabyte file that compressed down from a 13.5 gigabyte file, because that's just how the Windows zip installation works. So finally, at this point, now a full 26.5 hours after the game jam began, I was able to finally open the Unreal Game Engine on my own computer. In spite of all this, I was able to get at least a little bit of work done on the main menu system and the UI for my team. So I was productive in some regard, especially given that I didn't know anything about this engine and that I had spent more than half of the weekend trying to install it on my own computer. Once I had finally gotten it open, there was several things that I have criticism for that don't pertain to the installation process. The first being that I had sent my team a copy of the Cinti low polygon farming pack, which I had, and it was fitting for our theme and what we were trying to build. The game that we were building, by the way, was a Doom style first person shooter type game where you're walking around as a cat trying to attack these beats that are mutant beats that are attacking you, because the theme was roots, and so that's how the theme roots played into beats. And so I had sent my team this low polygon Cinti pack, and they dragged it into the project and it immediately broke, because apparently the Unreal Engine saves its asset references via string. So if you pull anything from an external third party into the project that is not stored in the exact same string path location, it breaks, which is ridiculous, given that Unity has their meta files with the GUID numbers. You can move any file to anywhere in that project and it will just still work. To the credit of Unreal Engine, I will give them credit for this. Because they don't have these meta files, they don't have to import all of the assets as the Unity does, and it doesn't lead to hours upon hours of waiting for projects to open, especially in Unity. If the Unity engine crashes for whatever reason, and I go to open a project, half of the time it decides, oh, let's import all of the assets from scratch, and waste your entire day doing so. Unreal Engine doesn't have that problem. The engine is incredibly buggy, and it does crash quite often, probably more often than Unity, but when it does crash, I can immediately open it without having to wait hours and hours to do so. Also, because it doesn't use the metafile system that Unity does, I can open assets and they don't cause a 60 gigabyte library file to be created on my computer with all of the data that gets put in the library file when Unity opens and imports assets. Now, one of the things that I don't like about the Unreal Engine is that it will randomly delete files. They'll just randomly go missing. There were several times that I had created a file and then I had done some work in it, and then I had saved that file, and then when I had closed the editor to do a git push, because it would not let me commit any of the changes as long as the editor was open, I had reopened the editor after the git push and those files had been deleted. And I said git push, not pull. It's not as though someone on the remote side of the GitHub project had not done a correct pull and I had pulled their changes and the file went missing. I did a git push to my own branch and those files just randomly deleted, so then I'd have to create them again. There were several times that had happened. There was also several times where when I was opening the project, it would recreate the version number as this weird hash number on the project, and then I would have to uncommit that file and the changes I had made, as the version number on everyone else's editor said 4.27. On mine, it was this really bizarre hash, and the only reason that I could think for why that happened was because I was opening the editor that wasn't installed properly through the Epic Game Launcher. I was just opening the executable directly. And so the rest of the game jam went off without relatively much of a hitch. There was a person that left our team because they got sick, and so we were down a team member and we were working to the wire to complete the project by 5 p.m. on Sunday afternoon. As you always are in a game jam, you're rushed with time, but I feel that I did get a good amount of learning in the blueprint system. Now, if there's one thing that I did learn, and if there's one thing that I am more certain of now than I was previously to the weekend, it is that it is entirely irrelevant to know the difference between stack and heap memory in order to be a professional game developer. Now, if you don't know what I'm referring to, I would advise you to check out the video that I had done on why it is virtually impossible to pass the technical coding interview. It is a very long rant. It's about an hour and 20 minutes long. So if you don't want to watch the entire thing, then I at least recommend that you watch the chapters that are specifically about the questions, as I give real-world examples of questions that companies will ask during a technical job interview. And in those questions, they asked me a lot of irrelevant things, in my opinion, to game development, such as the difference between stack and heap memory, or, you know, the specifics of how a hashing table works. And I can say certainly that I see a possibility that someone could make an entire game from start to finish using UI and input and camera controllers and movement and enemies and AI and shooting and logic and all of that entirely from start to finish exclusively using the blueprint system in Unreal Engine. And the reason I can say this definitively is that we did make a game from start to finish, and I never once touched C++ the entire weekend. So in the end, I really didn't learn anything over the weekend that I didn't already know in terms of C++, and that would maybe help me answer some of the technical questions should I get them in the future. I'm probably no better off now than I was Friday evening in terms of passing the technical C++ questions, but I do know how to use the blueprint system in Unreal, and it is incredibly powerful, and you can make a game entirely using blueprints and never have to touch C++, which is actually remarkable to me, given that several years ago I had been programming in an engine called Stencil, which uses a visual coding tool similar to Scratch. And I was told by virtually every single game developer that I knew working in the industry that if I ever wanted to be treated as a professional, real-life developer that I had to ditch using Stencil because it's this obscure engine that nobody has heard of, and it doesn't use real coding because you're just dragging colorful blocks onto a canvas and connecting them together. Well, if that's Stencil, then what the hell is the blueprint system in Unreal but dragging colorful blocks onto a canvas and connecting them together? But no, you're not a real developer unless you're coding with your bare knuckles. So the fact that major AAA game studios use Unreal and other tools like it, and the fact that you can make an entire game using only blueprints and not have to touch C++, it is actually quite surprising to me that other people that I've known who work in this industry would even tell me such a thing, that you're not a real coder unless you're coding directly with the typing on a keyboard, because they should recognize and understand that coding is a lot more about logic and how you structure a system than whether or not you can type out the correct syntax on a command line. And I personally prefer visual coding because it entirely removes any errors that are caused by incorrect syntax, which happens quite a bit, even at the professional level. Now, the one criticism that I do have for the blueprints is because you are doing everything visual, there was several circumstances where I had just forgotten to connect up one of the nodes to the input of another node. And so I had written out a function or something that had done a bunch of things, but then because there was nothing actually triggering that function, it wasn't being called. And it's not immediately obvious the same way that it's immediately obvious when you're typing out code that, oh, hey, I made this function, but I'm actually not calling it anywhere. It's not referenced anywhere in the project, and so it's not being used. It's a little bit more difficult, especially when the nodes are really close, to not see that there's no connector. You're missing a connector between the output of one function to the input of another. Now, the final thing that I will praise the Unreal Engine for before letting you go and giving you a little bit of video from the game that we actually completed this weekend during the Game Jam, the one positive thing I will say about it is that it doesn't charge for extra features the same way that Unity does. From my understanding, you can make a game for consoles, PlayStation, Nintendo, Xbox, in Unreal without ever having to pay a particular license fee. Now, that could change in the future, depending how the market and the economy goes. But right now in Unity, if you want to do that, you have to pay their $5,000 a year yearly license to do that, which entirely eliminates basically anyone from that ability to do so who's not a AAA studio. $5,000 a year for a license is like half of the money that I make an entire year of the work that I do. I don't get paid very much. And so for me to spend or invest 6 months of my income into just one license only to make a Xbox game that probably won't sell that well anyways is not very it's not a good return on investment. But I don't have to worry about that. If I was to pick up Unreal and really learn the ins and outs and make a game with that, I could export it for consoles if I ever wanted to in the future without having to pay an additional license fee. So I will give them that to their credit. So that's about all I have to say for now. Make sure to like the video if you agreed with what I said, if you agree with the criticisms I have of the Unreal Engine, if you have also had problems installing it. Let me know in the comments below whether you prefer using Unity or whether you prefer using Unreal, and maybe give a reason why. Other than that, thank you for watching the video, and until then, I'll see you in the next one. Bye.